restrictions on free speech are like poison gas in a room. There's no way to control which way that gas goes. There's no way to control which way the restrictions are utilized or unutilized. And I feel so weird talking about this because I was critiquing liberal policymakers in 2018, 2019 who are doing the exact same thing on the other side. Free speech for me, not for thee. That is what's on my mind today. Welcome, everybody, my amazing friends, to the Hopeful Majority. Every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we come at you live. I'm actually today coming from St. Olaf College in Minnesota, where we were talking about building some bridges, talking to young people across the country, meeting college students, hearing what people are thinking. And here's what is so particularly striking about the moment that we live in. As you know, in the Hopeful Majority, we always talk about principles like free speech, listening to viewpoints that are different than ourselves, being open-minded, being curious, being introspective. And what's odd about the moment that we live in, and what's especially weird over, I think, the last 7 years of building Bridge USA, the organization that I help lead, where we have college campus chapters across the country, building this podcast with you, having you come along the journey, is that it seems like the average American, everyday people, most people in our society, left or right, believe in these principles. They believe in free speech. They want to be able to have conversations with people that are different than us. We want to be able to listen to each other, have disagreements, not sing some kumbaya and hold our hands up, but be able to actually have real arguments. And yet, it seems that the people that are least committed to these principles are those in power, the elites, the people that uphold what I call the outrage industrial complex. Now, you say, Manu, what do you mean by that? What do you mean the people in power are the people that are least committed to this, to the principle of free speech? Well, I think that we are so incredibly polarized that in the pursuit of power, people believe in free speech. But when they get power, they don't believe in free speech anymore. It seems like free speech is a means to power, saying that the other side hates free speech, critiquing things like cancel culture, critiquing things like the quote unquote woke mob, is a way for us to rile up our base. But once we're in power, I don't know. Well, you might be wondering, well, this is an attack against the Trump administration. No, it's not actually. Let me step back for a second. For those of you that don't know, I helped start Bridge USA in 2017, which was now, I guess, 8 years ago, which is crazy to think about. 8 years ago, I was a college freshman. I was a pre-med student. I had no interest in politics, democracy, any of this stuff. I did some high school debate, but beyond that, I wasn't the nerd that was getting out of bed saying, I want to build an organization. And sometimes I'm like, man, I should have just been a doctor. Wouldn't have that been easier? So I started college 2017, February 2nd, 2017. We had these giant protests on campus because a speaker came to campus named Milo Yiannopoulos. And this was at UC Berkeley. Milo Yiannopoulos came to campus. And now he was seen as a right-wing provocateur. Trust me, him being right-wing is not what matters in this context. What matters is that what followed was some of the largest protests in Berkeley's history since the 60s. And it was largely people like Antifa coming in. They totally upheavaled and upturned the campus and led to some massive riots, a lot of violence, a lot of property damage. There was a lot of conflict, a lot of tension, right? And so the next day, me and some random people, we got together and we said, hey, let's create a space for dialogue and discussion. I tell you the story because this protest, along with a few other protests at places like Middlebury College, a protest against a guy named Charles Murray, it caused this narrative to start in the country that the left was culturally against free speech, or that it was creating a censorship culture, that the left did not believe in certain ideas being allowed into the Overton window of conversation, right? You know what I'm talking about. And so over the last 7 years, one of the centerpieces of the conservative backlash to liberal dominance of culture has been that the left does not care about speech, that the left is not interested in conversation, that the left, let's say, quote unquote, believes in wokeism as opposed to actual concepts, that the left is not interested in complex thinking, but it's more constricted by an ideology. A lot of critiques that I think are relatively true and accurate. That's why we started building and growing this hopeful majority. And yet, just in the last 4 months, and especially in the last 3 months since President Trump has been in office, there's been a couple of things that have happened that seem to be particularly focused against free speech from the Trump administration. People have been bringing up the example of students like Muhammad Khalil getting detained at Columbia. He was a graduate student. The other day, we had a student, I think at Tufts University, that was detained by ICE. Now, a lot of people might say, Manu, these are not U.S. citizens, so the free speech right does not apply. Yes, that is true on legal terms, but it certainly seems to be creating a censorship culture on campus. People are starting to say, hey, am I allowed to, let's say, have pro-Palestinian views? Am I allowed to critique the state of Israel? Am I allowed to be able to say what's on my mind? there seems to be a level of hypocrisy. It seems like the Trump administration is doing what it critiqued the Biden administration doing rightfully, which was starting to interfere on the First Amendment to sort of further its policy goals, its cultural goals. And the reason I'm talking about this a little bit timidly and a little bit uh, suspect of what's going on is because to me it starts to feel a little hypocritical. And this has been happening over the last 7 years. Here's my view. Here's what I've started to come to. And this is why I think places like the Hopeful Majority, podcasts, independent media, conversation spaces, Bridge USA chapters, all these different organizations doing great work, why they're so important. It's that people in power will utilize agendas, will utilize rights, will stand behind and say, I believe in this thing as long as it gets them power. And I think that sets a really, really dangerous precedent. Um, does the Trump administration actually believe that woke mobs are not a good thing? Well, if that was the case, right now you go on X and you see videos of people that are keying Teslas. And I saw this case of this guy named Jim Pellis, I think. You can put the tweet up if you're on YouTube. You can watch this right now live. There's a guy named Jim Pellis, and the right is saying, like, we got to come after his employer. He's got to be kicked out. This is terrible. This is not the case. And yet, I remember this exact behavior happening on the left during the COVID pandemic, where the right was very critical because people that were unvaccinated were getting doxxed and exposed, and people were going after them and their employers. I don't know. Does that seem a little hypocritical? You might, let's say, strongly disagree with the views of the students that seem to be being detained right now. You may be very critical of the protests that happened post October 7th at American College campus. That was certainly the case for us. I believe that what we need more is dialogue and conversation on campus, is not protests and intimidation. I think we need to be able to resolve our differences. And yet, that is not what's happening. Whether you disagree or agree with the views of those students, we can all say that creating a culture on a campus or in broader American society where people feel like they have to self-censor what's on their mind because they fear retribution. My friends on the right, this was the exact thing that you were criticizing the friends on the left for in September, in October, heck, even November after winning the election. Now, let me be clear. This is not me just going after the right in this moment. This is me pointing out another instance of hypocrisy. This is not just a right issue. This is not just a left issue. We need to build a society in which we genuinely understand and believe that dialogue, deliberation, free speech are not right principles. They're not left principles. They are American principles. They are crucial to the bedrock of what we call a deliberative democracy. I was on St. Olaf's campus the other day, which is a small liberal arts college in Northfield, Minnesota. Generally liberal leaning environment, but very wonderful people, very nice people. The Minnesota nice thing, by the way, I can say that idea that Minnesotans are just too nice, oftentimes to a fault, is absolutely true. I appreciated the hospitality. We go on campus, and again, you can feel that vibe of people are walking on eggshells. People are scared to say what's on their mind. You say the word DEI and you feel like your funding's going to get cut. And again, I'm saying this is irrelevant of whether or not you believe in DEI or you don't believe in DEI. If you believe that the protests after October 7th were justified or they weren't justified, the point is we have to be able to take off our partisan blinders. We have to be able to take off our red sunglasses, our blue sunglasses, and instead just take off all sunglasses, period, and say, I'm going to call balls and strikes the way they come. We have to de-link the politicization of our rights from the fight for power. The right, the left, the extremes, I don't think they have our best interests in mind. What they have in mind is to push through their agenda. And I think a fundamentally American belief, a fundamentally enlightened belief is to say, yes, my views matter. Yes, my policy matters. But what's more important is the rights and freedoms of our American citizens. What's more important is the ability for me to say what's on my mind, because you know what's more durable than a policy achievement, especially in today's polarized environment? It's my right to have free speech. It's my right to say what's on my mind. Now, let me preempt something that people might say. They might say, Manu, you're creating a false equivalency. The left had cultural censorship. The right is using the actual states of the government to go after speech. Well, first, let me say President Biden wanted to cancel TikTok, which was a very free speech oriented move that people felt like was going against free speech. President Biden also went after folks like Julian Assange. You can come up with legal breaches of the First Amendment, frankly, the Constitution period, in any presidential administrations. I don't think that argument has a lot of valence. But the second piece of that argument is that, well, there's actual brazen attacks right now from the Trump administration. Let me say this. Imagine I asked you, or I told you, hey, this guy got hit over the head with a baseball bat, and you say, that's really bad, but this guy used a pickaxe, and that's even worse. The fact is that the patient still suffered. The person still got hurt. They got damaged. It, liberal cultural censorship, conservative institutional censorship, it's censorship, period. And it shouldn't happen. We have to build a culture not where we try to police ideas or we try to say, man, this view, if it comes in American society, it's inherently dangerous, or that view should be championed more. How about we actually establish a free market of ideas where people of very different views can constructively engage, constructively listen, dialogue, have conversations, be able to meet disagreement with vociferous disagreement as well, but then be able to say, look, I, as a fellow American, don't hate you. Instead, I understand your views. If we actually had that culture of dialogue, it would undermine the need for us to police views. Policing views when you're in power is a band-aid. And not only is it a band-aid, it sets a precedent. Restrictions against free speech, as a man named Ira Glasser once said, who used to lead the ACLU, said restrictions on free speech are like poison gas in a room. There's no way to control which way that gas goes. There's no way to control which way the restrictions are utilized or unutilized. And I feel so weird talking about this because I was critiquing liberal policymakers in 2018, 2019 who are doing the exact same thing on the other side. Point of all this is that the reason why I think efforts like the hopeful majority, bridging, dialogue are so important is because the silent majority of people believe in these principles, but the loud minority of voices have a stranglehold on the microphone. And because of their pursuit of power, because of their belief in outrage, we are playing ourselves into this outrage industrial complex. And what we need to do is we need to hit the eject button. And we need to see the partisan game for what it is, which is that when every 4 years there's an election, someone will come into your neighborhood, they'll say, this side believes this, I need your vote. And the other side will say, this side believes this, I need your vote. And then nothing happens. I think what's more important and what's needed is a foundational commitment to conversation dialogue. It's what our students across the country are doing. You can go to previous episodes like our Columbia student leaders, Ven Meester at Wyoming, episode 82. You can go to episode 84 where we talk to a Republican pollster who discusses the unity that a lot of Americans feel around a frustration of their institutions, the possibility for conversation. So where does this all come to? Free speech for me, not for thee. Let's see through the partisan game. Part of what our goal of the show as it continues to evolve is to say, dialogue is the new rebellion against the outrage industrial complex. And we, as Americans, are not going to fall for partisan games. Instead, we're going to call balls and strikes, and we're going to stand for principles like open-minded conversation, deliberative democracy, free speech for every American, period, full stop. And importantly, if we create this ethos, people will actually engage with a good faith argument. People will engage because they trust each other and they care about each other. And that's the ethos you need. Hey, if you appreciated this, if you appreciated the conversation, every Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple, we are going to build this hopeful majority together. We're now in the high 80s of our episode count. And look, we're going to keep building this thing because the American people, the demand for our policies, for our politics, of this notion of conversation dialogue is growing. So let's build this thing together. I'll see you next month.